Yes, I'm good to present, Mark.
Excellent. So straight over to you then, Alistair.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Fabulous. So, afternoon, everybody. I'm Alistair Semple. My pronouns are he, him, and I work at Microsoft as the school's portfolio manager. So I'm looking after digital skills for K-12 in the schools area. I'm also a proud trans man who is passionate about education, inclusivity, and creating spaces where everybody is welcome. Today, though, I want to focus on trans inclusion. So I do want to say as a pre-warning, some of the topics and the statistics that are in my presentation could be triggering to some people. So feel free to step out, take a breather if you need to, because I know this is all going to be recorded and you can catch up with it at a later date. So I wanted to start a little bit about talking about me and my story to give you some context to this. So when you think of trans people, the media is often awash with stories about people who maybe knew from an early age that they were trans. And that really wasn't the case for me. I was kind of a rough and tumble child, but I was a very girly one. I'd love dressing up as a princess or trying on my mum's shoes, as you can see in this picture here. So I never really started exploring my identity until during my teen years, but I still somewhat identified as a woman. As you can see here in this picture, at 16, my prom dress was channeling princess vibes. I was comfortable being very girly. And growing up in the late 90s through to the noughties in the Midlands, visibility for trans people really wasn't a thing. At the most, trans women would be the butt of jokes by edgy comedians. And as for trans men, as far as society was concerned, they didn't exist. In fact, I didn't see someone trans masculine until I got into YouTube as a teenager, and that was a revelation. So I came out as queer when I was 17, about a year after that middle photo. And since then, I have made changes to my name, my hair, my body, my style to better fit my identity and feel more comfortable in myself. Right now, I'm coming to you as someone who's 10 years into their social transition. So that is living as my real gender. And I'm coming up to a year in my medical transition. So also, prior to my medical transition, I had been 3 years on an NHS waiting list. So as you can see, I am very visibly queer. I have blue hair here, teal hair in that picture, and I enjoy all things rainbow and actively speak about these aspects of my life like I am with you today. That said, being visible can have a huge impact on your life as a trans person. So let's get some context about the cost of being visibly trans. To set the scene in the workplace, over a quarter of trans people are not open with anybody about their gender, and that rises to 37% for non-binary people. So that's people who are not any of the two genders that are most widely accepted by society, male and female. And then speaking historically, over half of trans and non-binary people have, as a collective, at some point hidden that they are LGBT plus at work because they were afraid of discrimination. Now, if we look at schools, when it comes to the classroom or lecture hall, 45% of students believe that educational environments are not safe for trans people. So that's almost half. And over half, 2/3 in fact, believe that transphobia that's happening in general society, the media, and in education is harming the safety of trans students in schools, colleges, and universities. So what's the cost? Well, 41% of trans people have experienced a hate crime or another incident aimed at them due to being transgender. And those who are in the 18 to 24-year-olds are facing the greatest risk, with over half of them experiencing a hate crime. I can talk about this personally. So I went to London Pride on Saturday, and on what should have been one of the most exciting days of the year for me as a visible trans or queer person, I was heckled in the street by several people who used slurs against me. So there's a very real fact of these things happening. And if you compare that to other people who are part of the LGBT community who are not trans, so lesbian, gay and bisexual people who are cisgender, that's only 16% of people compared to the 41%. So what this really boils down to is protecting people. So 46% of trans people have thought about taking their own life in the past year. And if we look across the board at trans adults, over their lifetime, a third of trans adults will have attempted suicide at least once. So visibility and representation can be wonderful, but it can really easily become a trap, a way to identify and target some of our most marginalised communities. And why trans people like myself have the privilege of being able to celebrate the visibility, for many, hiding their identity is really a matter of safety. So with the current climate, so the government backing out of conversion therapy bans for trans folk, hate crime rates rising, and the media debating trans people's validity on a daily basis, it's really not a great place to be a trans person in this country. So we need to shift our focus from visibility to making sure that spaces trans people live, work and learn in are safe before we encourage people to come out. So this is all about fostering inclusive spaces. And today I want to be particular, given that you're educators, that we're talking about business and education. So as you can see from the statistics I shared, excluding the most vulnerable people has lifelong consequences in terms of people's self-belonging, mental health and academic or career progress. It's clear that to enable visibility, you have to make sure that the space is inclusive. You can't thrive in a place where you're scared to be yourself. So I have some basic tips for fostering these inclusive spaces as somebody who has the lived experience of going through both education and into a corporate business setting as a queer person. So education. In the LGBTQI community, it's really a well-known joke that queer kids have an affinity with their English teachers or other teachers. They find a supportive adult in school sometimes. And there really is some truth to that. So finding that supportive adult role model can be life-changing for so many children, especially those who have a difficult home life. And school can be a sanctuary for them. So looking at schools in particular, from my experience, my first tip would be to avoid assumptions. So looking at somebody, a student, it doesn't always equal their gender. Some people are more willing to dress more out there. Some people are maybe gonna dress a little bit more conservatively. But it's important to, across the board, not make that assumption of somebody and then use maybe gendered pronouns towards them. So from that pronouns point, think about the language you use. Using they for those of you don't know, or displaying your own pronouns and asking for students' pronouns, they're all amazing, great first steps. But also be mindful of when you use these pronouns. It might be the case that a student is comfortable using she, her at school, but maybe doesn't feel comfortable in letting other people in their life know that yet. In that case, it's important to establish when and where these are needed. A really successful way of doing this that I've seen in a school context is people sending out a form at the start of the year that goes to the teacher, not anonymously, but privately, so the other students don't see it, that asks for the name and pronouns, and if there are any situations where a student would want different pronouns used. So with these activities, though, it's really important to include everybody so that LGBTQ students aren't singled out. Also, considering common classroom sayings is really important. Instead of things like boys or girls or saying guys, try gender neutral statements like everyone or like year 5, year 6, and avoid really stereotypical comments about girls do this, boys do this, or gendered splits in group work. So when I was at school, I remember it being boys on this side of the room, girls on the other side. And that can really be quite challenging for young people who are maybe questioning their identity. So I've covered activities, but facilities are also a big deal. So in my opinion, gender neutral bathrooms should be commonplace across the board, but at the very least, you should be advocating for gender diverse students to use the bathroom of their choosing. Similarly, if there's a uniform, then ask if it's if it's gender specific, ask why and push for that to change. Give students the option to wear what makes them feel most comfortable, be that a skirt, trousers, certain cut of blazer, and most importantly, advocate for them if they face any backlash, whether that is from other students or even staff members. And then finally, this is something that's really close to my heart because I feel like I didn't get enough of this at school, and it maybe impeded me having revelations about myself, is to make sure that diverse voices are represented in the curriculum and across extracurriculars. So in your classroom library, make sure there are books from LGBTQ authors with queer narratives, and make space for yourself to learn about the queer experience from activists so that you can have meaningful conversations about those texts. So now, when it comes to the workplace, a lot of these tips are really quite similar. So we have things like avoiding assumptions. We're all adults. We should know that we shouldn't be making assumptions about other people in the room. Language also, avoiding things like ladies and gentlemen, men and women, team, everyone, and much better representations of what you should use. And defaulting to they when talking about pronouns of people you don't know. Also, a really great thing to do is when you're on Teams, display your pronouns. You can add it to your name, or you can add it to the pop-up box that comes up, and talk about them in your introductions and ask people. And not just if you're not sure, make a point of in a meeting asking everybody their pronouns if it's a bunch of people you've not met before. If you make a mistake, that's also fine. Just apologize, correct yourself and move on. That's all it takes. You don't need to dwell on it. Again, with facilities, many businesses really seem to be improving, at least in my experience, but gender neutral bathrooms should be the norm. One company that I visited had 3 options. It had a bathroom with urinals, one with toilets, and then one strip of several self-contained stalls that had sinks, so that those were completely gender neutral. And that way, there's total privacy for those who maybe want or require it, maybe for religious or personal reasons, but without segregating gender diverse people. Another really key thing that you can do in the workplace or just amongst colleagues or in professional settings, I think, is challenge those prejudices. Often it can be really intimidating for maybe the only trans or the only marginalized person in the room to speak up when somebody, especially a superior, is making an insensitive comment due to the backlash that you might get. So allies can make that amazing advocates by challenging those comments. Something as simple as asking what somebody meant by their comment, or taking them aside and letting them know what they said or did isn't appropriate. And also, I would say check in with your trans colleagues to see if they are okay after any incident. I think that's a step that a lot of people forget to do. And finally, when you're doing work on trans inclusion, or indeed, I guess, any inclusion, it's really important for the workplace you're in to walk the walk as well as talking the talk. So are trans people given platforms in your organisation? Are LGBTQ community members building frameworks for inclusion? Or are those opportunities just taken up by loud allies? It's really, really vital to let those marginalised communities form the policies around inclusion and equality, because it's meant to be benefiting them and everybody around them. So you've done some great work. You feel like you're being progressive. So I wanted to bring attention to a few things that are maybe a little bit false friends when we're talking about trans inclusion. So I see a lot of these statements floated around, even in the place that I work now and places that I've worked in the past and in the classroom. And I think that people get a little bit caught up in trying to say the right thing, that sometimes it goes to the other extent and it then becomes problematic again. So I often see this statement: women and people who identify as women. So this kind of tends to single out people who are maybe not cis women. So instead of saying that, just say all women. And then you can further clarify that this includes cis and trans women and non-binary people who identify with womanhood. This way you are listing all of the different people you feel are part of that group without leaving anybody out. It's not saying like normal women and trans women. And the same goes for men-only groups. I also have seen a really massive trend of women and non-binary people being lumped together in terms of different groups or activities. So this often alienates non-binary people who don't feel an affinity to womanhood, and as well as trans men or transmasculine people who maybe are affected by the same things as the people in that group. A better option would just be marginalised or underrepresented groups, or be specific about the group that you're looking to target with an activity that you're doing. And finally, preferred pronouns. Now, I don't mind this one so much myself, but definitely being preferred implies kind of that something's optional. You should maybe only say my preferred pronouns are he, him in this situation, but I prefer something else in another. So pronouns just on their own, if you're talking about the general pronouns somebody's using, and these should always be respected no matter how you feel about the person. So to really summarize it all, I know I've talked a lot of stuff about strategy at you, but actually it's really important to remember that this is a journey. Even as a trans person, I'm still learning from other people in my community about how I can be a better ally to people whose experiences that I don't share. And what's really important is to keep learning and showing people that you're committed to being an ally to trans folk or anybody in the LGBT community. If you misstep or make a mistake, that's okay. Just apologise, take the feedback and be proactive in learning how to do better next time. Honestly, as long as you're willing to learn and grow, that is all that matters. So thank you very much for listening. I've really enjoyed talking to you all. If you'd like to connect with me on LinkedIn, feel free to reach out via email if you have any questions.
Thank you so much, Alistair. We're going to move very swiftly on to our next presentation.